Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Emerging Company Showcase, an event series partnered with the New York Stock Exchange to bring New York's financial community together with groundbreaking companies. Thanks so much to our sponsors, Woodruff Sawyer, Goodwin, Newmark, Moses & Singer, Trinet, and PHCBI. Our lunch panel for the event was the discussion on the future of finance, development, and innovation in biotech, featuring Mike Ray of IdeaPharma and Ricky Sun of Bain Capital, moderated by Coady of Woodruff Sawyer.
Good morning. I am Sean Coady, Senior Vice President at Woodruff Sawyer. I'm thrilled to be moderating today's panel on transatlantic investing. Before we get started, I want to say a quick thank you to the New York Bio Association and the New York Stock Exchange for providing a platform that brings together New York's financial community and a group of emerging biotech companies that are developing novel therapeutics and technologies that could revolutionize patient care. We're hoping for this to be a very interactive panel with the audience, so please feel free to use the box to the right of the video to input any questions that you have for the panelists as we go throughout the presentation. I'm very excited to share this panel this morning with two extremely distinguished panelists, Ricky Sun and Mike Ray. I'll do a quick intro of the two of them and then we'll get started. So by way of background, Ricky is a managing director at Bain Life Sciences. Ricky has an extensive background in biotech and pharma, not only as an investor, but also as an operator, including working as the director of corporate development and strategy at Biogen. He's served in senior roles at Wall Street firms such as BlackRock, and he actually began his career as a senior scientist at Ironwood Pharmaceuticals, where he was involved in the discovery and development of the drug Linzess for irritable bowel syndrome. And we also have Mike Ray. Mike is the founder and CEO of IdeaPharma. IdeaPharma is a path-to-market design strategy practice which has particular expertise in early-stage development. Mike is a renowned pharma innovator and has been recognized as such throughout the industry. He refers to himself as a pharma innovator, protagonist, antagonist, and geek. And he's also the creator of the annual Pharma Innovator Index, among other accomplishments. So I'm thrilled to have both of these individuals on the panel today. And I thought what we would do is kind of start the discussion and set the stage on transatlantic investing and building companies. And so with that, I thought the appropriate place to start the conversation was around the idea of innovation. And so Mike, I thought we'd start with you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your view of innovation in the space and some of the differences between, for instance, creating an idea and innovating.
Thanks, Sean. And I mean, you touched on this, right, with the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index that I think for those who don't know what it is, I think it started about 11 years ago. We were sitting around on a Friday afternoon at IDEA talking about a very simple question, which is if you gave the same asset to two different companies at the beginning of phase one, would they be equally successful? And everyone kind of knew the answer was no, but no one knew why or what the terms of reference would be that would differentiate the kind of paths those assets would take. So we set out to answer the question, and actually it turns out there's a bunch of those case studies where people have the same drug and they do, differently well in terms of the outcome. And actually, you referred to Ricky's Biogen background. I mean, lots of people had the same asset as Biogen, and not everyone has had the same outcome, right? So, so we set out to say that innovation, if you define it tightly, is about the creation of value. It isn't about invention. It isn't about coming up with a molecule in the first place. It's about what you do with it. And that could apply to digital therapeutics. It could apply to devices. It could apply to molecules. But we try and tie it firmly down to how and whether the company adds value to its pipeline. That difference between the idea, the invention, and the innovation actually does come down to how people organize next to the opportunity.
And Ricky, as an investor, how do you think about innovation? How does it influence the way you evaluate an investment opportunity?
Yeah, I think I just want to follow up. Mike said it very well. Innovation is not defined in one set of things. It could be digital therapies, it could be a device, could be a drug, it could be many different ways how we even engage the healthcare ecosystem. So from an investor's point of view, however we think, from a investor point of view, it's really about how you think about cash flow, the future generation of cash flow that would justify kind of the value expectation we see as an investor. I think that's kind of marrying the two things, right? The excitement of the future and how we can bridge it through more fundamental core value creation process.
Do you see a role, Ricky, for investors in helping to drive innovation in the space?
We hope so, right? I think I get asked this a lot when I was a public investor, and now more so as a kind of a both private, also public investor. I would say absolutely. In many ways, I think the classic way how people frame this is that investors kind of try to weed out the ones who are thinking about it but may not be successful. But selection bias is such that you get those who are ultimately most successful and have the most funding. And so investors tend to gravitate towards the survival bias, so to speak. I think as a private investor, what we try to do also is to be able to see the value curve, so-called inflection earlier, and to be able to identify and cultivate the ones we think have the disruption potential, but also to be able to provide the capital to support those type of companies to achieve the ultimate goal.
From a communication perspective, Mike, do you see any difficulty between the communication of the innovation side of the house and the investment side of the house? It seems to me that there can be a breakdown at times in terms of taking the innovation from an idea and turning it into a business that is investable. So talk a little bit, if you can, about kind of that communication between invention and investing.
Yeah, it's the business that we're in, right? Which is to say that the molecule itself may well do what it needs to do, and actually the early phase is typically characterized by under exploration of what that asset might do. We kind of hope that it's an RA drug. We kind of hope that it's that it is what we want it to be, and so we kind of make sure we kind of hitting that square peg into a round hole all the way through development. But the kind of investment hypothesis is where it turns into a business plan, right? Which is, could you launch it? Could you get someone to write a script? Could you get someone to decide to reimburse it? These are different questions. And also, the questions that attached to the business plan are, how quickly could you launch it? Could you launch it in a rare disease first and get a higher price and, gain traction that way? Could you launch it, through a low risk path? So I think some of this business planning is typically at odds with the kind of scientists who might have, had, visions of saving the world when they first developed the molecule. It may well do what they want it to do. And a lot of what we've seen over the years is often the scientists lose touch with the molecule as it goes into the kind of major pharma pipeline, ends up in a place they didn't expect because of that business pressure. And then you end up with that tension between the kind of inventors and the innovators if you apply that definition of value.
Ricky, from your perspective on the investment side, have you seen situations where there was a disconnect between the innovation and the investment thesis?
Oh, for sure. Plenty. I think Mike alluded to this. This is a great segue as I think about it, as a former R&D scientist who, have gone through Series A, B, C, private financing and also gone public. I think there's one aspect of this is quite interesting, is that as a scientist, you think a lot more about your molecule or your innovation or invention and how exciting and cool that could be. And many of us who came from that realm didn't really have the expertise or the know-how to understand what does it take to bring that particular invention, that molecule, so to speak, ultimately to the finishing line, that is, give it to the patients that actually needs it. And that's usually, as I was told early on in my career, 10+ year journey. And maybe that's accelerated a little bit in the last couple of decades, but still, it's a long journey. So the question is, what's required along the way, right? A is, of course, there's experienced management team, but B is also the funding that's needed to get there. It's a very expensive business. So oftentimes we lose sight of what's the critical path? What do we need to do at each step of the way to be able to fund that to the next so-called value inflection point? And as I got more into the financing side of things, I started to realize, we need to learn both sides so that it's not just one track where it's only innovation, the idea, but we need to marry that to the funding needs and how we couple them together the most successful executives and the companies are the ones understood how to put them together. Once you understand that, I think the chances of succeeding gets much higher. And if I were to take a step back and, from an investor point of view, what are we looking for? We're looking for entrepreneurs, management, and boards who understand that and speak that language with us. And then there's a more likely chance that we can help the management team, the board, to achieve those goals.
Thanks, Ricky. Mike, a question for you while we're on the topic of innovation. When you think about innovation in the biotech or pharma industry, do you see certain areas or geographies around the world where it's harder or easier to innovate?
Yes. Yeah. And I'm building on what Ricky said, because I think that's also a great segue to the geography question. The molecule that is first discovered is the same molecule that you launch maybe 10 years, 15 years later. All you're doing in between that point is collecting evidence. That's all, right? So all of that value is built on your ability to collect the evidence along the way. But there's been this interesting trend over the 10 years we've done the innovation index, which is the decline and fall of Europe, essentially as a space for development. So if you exclude Switzerland and you exclude the UK, Europe has almost nothing left. I mean, there's a couple of German companies still clinging on. So clearly, you'd say, well, look, Europe is doing something different than the rest than the US is, and overwhelmingly, 95% of everything's coming out of the US. We've got Beijing and a couple of others coming out of China now. Japan had a great ride, but isn't doing so well. So then you say, well, what would be the fundamentals of that? And I think there's a lot to do with the organizations, the kind of, the structures of those organizations. I had a great conversation with the head of Lilly's R&D recently about the kind of way that they've changed their model in innovation to really reflect kind of, multiple biotechs instead of the kind of monolithic company structure, which a lot of European companies have found difficult to let go of. They've still got the head of R&D that says yes and no to everything. So, as Ricky says, those decisions along the way are often taken either by a kind of, sage leader, or they're taken by the kind of companies that you're acquiring along the way. And I think Europe's taken a lot longer to get used to the idea that biotech is really where those affinity groups, those kind of early stage, the people that really understood the molecule, understood the opportunity, that they are often outside the pharma company instead of inside the pharma company.
So a question from one of the members of the audience, and I'll put this question to both of you. So when you think about changes in the biotech space and some of the significant funding rounds and the early access to public capital through IPOs and SPACs, the question is, how does that access to capital impact innovation? You presumably it would benefit innovation, but could it somehow inhibit the ability to innovate because there's so much cash and other business constraints?
I can start. Yes, there's a lot of, there's no shortage of cash coming into the marketplace in the last few years. And I would say 2020 even magnified even more, just, with the pandemic and the focus on having treatment and vaccines, everything else related to a pandemic makes kind of life science much more fashionable, trending for general investors. That said, I think this is a double-edged sword, right? And one is that there is a lot more demand for innovation within our ecosystem. The question is, do we really have that much really great innovation that deserves that kind of capital? And that's the push and pull. As we saw that there, I would say there is, the innovation takes time, as I said, 10 plus years, and things that takes a lot faster, the question is that justified, or are they the right type of technologies? Those are things that we wrestle a lot with. What makes it more challenging from an investor point of view is that the innovation curve has shifted to the left a little bit. And the second is that the expectation for the value is somewhat mismatched to the demand. So it's a supply-demand equation, but that's mismatched what we believe is a fundamental value. And so for investors' judgment point of view, I think there's one key question, and I know there's going to be a lot of people in the audience listening to this, is about, I would just challenge everybody to think about one thing, that is, do we really think at the end of the day, there is enough fundamental value embedded in one opportunity you're looking at today versus this is only kind of I will call a hypothesis, a dream you like to realize. And so that really anchors at least how we think about the future in terms of innovation. What we don't want to see is a mismatch ultimately results in many more failures and a lot of folks having, the capital that being put at risk down the road.
And Mike, from your perspective as an innovator, any thoughts on the influx of cash and the impact it can have on companies as they grow?
Yeah, so I think Ricky's point is well made, and I think there's this really interesting thing. It depends who the company is and whether they know what to do with that cash. So if you have like an oncology asset, right? I mean, the search for where that might work is hard and needs multiple parallel paths. Or you're constrained by your ability to pursue one path until it either works or it doesn't, and then you go back and revisit. So in a scenario like that could be fine. But there are equally, there are good, strong voices that say that constraint and restraint is a really good feature for companies in early stage, which is to eke out the bucks that you do have and to make better decisions because of it. Because along the way, the inflection points of value are really coming because you've collected meaningful evidence which says that you're worthy of going further, or you're suddenly investable. And I think one thing that we see is that companies that raise a lot early are, they're focused on an exit at phase one, an exit at phase two. They're quickly getting out. So they do the kind of minimum to persuade the BD people in pharma that they have a drug and that can be enough. We haven't seen a lot come through from that kind of environment, but the kind of cash constrained, interesting biotechs, I think, do often end up in interesting companies. So yeah, I think it does depend a lot on the kind of expertise of the founders, whether they know what to do with the money that they're getting, or if they're just doing nice pitch decks with it instead, or in getting headquarters in South San Francisco. Those kinds of things make a big difference.
And one last question around innovation. I'll start with Mike, and then we'll go to Ricky on this. So when you think of innovation, there's many different sources where innovation can come from. It can come from the entrepreneurs themselves, from academia, from government. Do you have any sense on whether one is better than another, or have you seen any consistent themes across the different areas of innovation?
Yeah, so and I think we saw this last year, right, with this conversation around who actually developed the COVID vaccines and the medicines, and where the IP should sit and where it doesn't sit. I think it ignores the role that a Pfizer plays in a BioNTech, ability to develop and distribute a vaccine. So if you apply our definition of innovation, where it sits may matter less, or where the invention comes from. If it, typically, often it comes out of academics in some way, and then they spin it out. That's a great point of origin. I think that if we can improve the friction or reduce the friction on the way through to people that can understand the opportunity. There's a great quote I pulled out of a book a couple of weeks ago about how the UK was the first to develop monoclonal antibodies in the universities here, and there was a letter back from the government here in the UK which said basically, we don't see any commercial opportunity for these things. Just let them go free to the world. We don't need to hold the IP. So I think it does tell you something about, if you see this as the business of adding value, of course, governments aren't very good at that. Of course, the academics aren't very good at that. And of course, the pharma companies are often the best at that, right? The kind of, the generation of meaningful value. So the great ideas, I think there's a lot of them. If you do even if you did a trawl of, how many assets have made it through phase one, and were successful but weren't further developed by the organizations that spun them out of their universities. There's about 650 of those phase one, completed assets that have been returned to the universities just because no one had the funds to develop them. Now, I believe in that 650, there's some blockbusters, there's some absolute dogs, but that tells you something about where we'll see innovation continue to happen. It's in the people that understand that part of the chain, how to take those ideas forward.
I'll just build on what Mike said. I think there's one element I find pretty interesting is that I think yes, it's right. Almost all of innovation today has some footprint, the genesis of it in academic world. Oftentimes, then the question becomes, how come, why don't we just go to the academic institution, look for the professors who have X, Y, Z fundamental basic research and build a company around that? The learning lesson for the last 5 decades plus is that, well, academics are basic researchers. There's one thing to be said about industrializing R&D, right? And having gone through the academic route and all the way to industry, I can tell you firsthand is that when I was younger, I understand how to do it on a basic research level. What I didn't understand how to translate that learning, the aspiration into the industry that is more precision about how to be a drug hunter, so to speak, right? In the biopharma realm, that's the language. And so I think there is a big filter that happens between the initial idea to actual realization of something that can be more tangible in the industrialized setting. And if I were to just say step one more to that, I think innovation happens both at small biotechs as well as larger companies like pharma, right? It used to be the rhetoric is always, large pharma can't innovate. They can, but they have competing programs. So it so happens that maybe the first 2 out of 10 can be funded, the other 8 just cannot. And so therefore, folks over time becomes disenfranchised in terms of what they will be willing to do and do for the longer term. So I think for the smaller companies, just because you have 1 to 2 programs, that's your survival, right? You depend on it. So therefore, the speed and the velocity at which you're willing to take on risk to push those programs forward to the next value creating point is much stronger. So as a result, what you see is that, oh, by the way, smaller companies seems to be more nimble, more faster, and they can get to the results that investors and other strategic acquirers like to see.
Yeah, I would echo what Ricky just said. I mean, if you let's take recent history, the checkpoint inhibitor market. Everyone had that as an opportunity. Every single company in the space, Genentech, AstraZeneca, many of them missed the wave. Merck were lucky that they had it from an old Organon acquisition that was sitting on the shelf. So when Yervoy kind of struggled through and dragged Nevo with it, they were able to respond, but they responded slowly. And I think that's often about decision making. And as Ricky says, I think if you're defending Avastin and Herceptin and a bunch of other things, you make different decisions about the kind of the kind of stuff that's coming through. So it really is this thing. I think certainly for biotech to understand that companies don't have just product optimization or maximization in mind. They're also looking at, well, what do we have to keep pumping? What's paying the mortgage on the building? All those kind of things, as well as what might we bring through and that's going to displace it. So I think that business of understanding the business is critical to the to how decisions get made.
Thanks, Mike. That's very insightful. I think it might make sense now to kind of pivot a little bit off of the conversation around innovation and start to think about how these companies can strategize on growth and fundraising. Ricky, I'm very curious to your thoughts in terms of how you think about deploying capital in this market. We've talked a little bit about the size of raises and the significant amount of cash that's being thrown at some of these assets. So when you think about an emerging growth biotech company and that initial investment, how do you kind of prioritize where you're going to deploy that capital?
Yeah, I think our strategy, at least at Bain Capital, hasn't really changed that much in the sense that we're looking for fundamentally interesting ideas at a reasonable value. There's a return to be had, but also more importantly, I think the first question you asked is about, how do we think this market and what are the important things? I always kept on saying is that it's a management team we can collaborate with. I think first and foremost is the team, right? I think that is a really important thing for us to think about deploying that kind of capital. And I think along the way, one of the things we start to think about also is not so much of, do we deploy capital for this round of funding versus for the future, right? Good investment funds think across the entire value chain, but also through time, how we make sure that we're supporting our company, not on day one, but 3 years from now, 5 years from now. So for a longer time vision, ultimately to the creation of a drug, getting approved, but also commercialization. So these are things we think a lot about in terms of how we want to deploy. And there are different mechanisms and different ways to support the company to go public, to be acquired, or through other vehicles that they can run, access capital. Those are all things that we talk very actively with our current portfolio companies, but also prospective companies we would like to invest with.
So just got an interesting question from one of the audience members. I'd love to get both of your perspectives on this. So the question is, if we think about human capital, what are some of the biggest opportunities in terms of team building at the board level? The questioner noted that all three of us are males. Is there a value of bringing some diverse perspectives to the board leadership?
Yeah, for sure. I can take this one. I'm currently on 3 boards, all 3 public. I think many of you in America, there are certain board requirements for diversity and inclusion, and I think it's a really important initiatives. I think in terms of all the boards I'm on, I think there have been substantial proactive recognition of this pretty early on, even when they were private, in terms of having the diversity and inclusion. I think that's really important. And second, I think it's not just for the sake of saying these. Actually think about different perspective each individual board members bring to the table. And I think it's not surprising when we talk about a lot of these things at the board level, right? Whenever you invite an independent board member, what are we looking for? What we're ultimately looking for are complementary skill sets that can help management team grow and guide them appropriately. I don't think of one member of the board can contain all the skill sets and experience. It's to be able to have that balance is the ultimate goal. And I think that's the way how we approach these.
Yeah, it's a great question, and but I think the question of why we want diversity is really important, right? Which is, I think you want diversity of opinions and perspectives and experiences and so forth to be brought to the table, and there's lots of ways of ensuring that. But I think the reason that you want that is because it's easy to end up in a monoculture in an organization where everyone just reinforces what they think the CEO wants to hear. And those are the worst organizations, though. I think the ones where the board, it's an active conversation about how to do something. There's challenge, there's experience, there's, it may well be, class, socioeconomic, it could be, racial, equality. I think there's a lot to bring to this question. And I think pharma's actually been very bad at it as well. I mean, we've kind of under-recognized actively and passively the kind of, the opportunity in getting outside of, North American, middle class, patients to go beyond that. But I think that I would draw back to, one of the things that we've seen in the innovation index over the years and goes back to this checkpoint inhibitor thing. I think the monoculture often emerges because the people that get promoted to the leadership got there because of what they did 10 years ago. They're not there for what they bring today, but what they brought 10 years ago. And I think that we heard this from Dan Skavronsky at Lilly that, if you're going to acquire Loxo, well, why not give them everything in oncology? Because, if you look at, say, the way Gilead has done this, it's an antiviral company, but it's trying to run an oncology business the same way you run an antivirals company. It doesn't work. I think you need diversity in all kinds of ways. You need the antagonists, you need the protagonists, and to be listening to different opinions along the way.
And I can just add one comment from my world in the public D&O world, where we broker public D&O for many public biotechs. From an underwriting perspective, underwriters are looking for that at the board level. They're looking for that diversity. They feel that the more diverse the board is, the better risk it will be. So I think it goes beyond, just operating the business. It impacts how your insurance providers and other providers look at you as well. So, it's kind of a great segue into, as these companies grow, the various inflection points that are possible. I know in the market today, there has been a lot of discussion around SPACs and de-SPACs, but in my experience, Most of the biotechs that we work with are kind of tracking towards the traditional IPO. So I'm curious to get your thoughts. Ricky, we'll start with you on maybe some differences between the way you look at an exit on an IPO versus a de-SPAC business combination.
Yeah, we thought quite a bit about this topic since the beginning of last year. In fact, we have been participants in other investors' SPAC. We have one of our portfolio companies actually was a de-SPAC merger target. We also have our own SPAC sponsor as well. So suffice to say that we certainly are in that game, so to speak. If I were to take a step back and just think about SPAC versus traditional IPO, why would you consider it? Why do we even bother with it? And from an investor's point of view, I think in our life science ecosystem, that's quite different, at least in the last 2 years from the past, also from other sectors like tech and others, is that SPAC, I don't consider this as a, traditionally has had a bad name in the sense it was a specialty vehicle for a lot of trading oriented investors to play around with, because there's a co-promote, sponsor, and then there's warrants attached to it. As we start to think about this and as the ecosystem evolved in the last couple of years, what we've seen is in the life science realm, this is a perfectly interesting alternative to an IPO because many of the sponsors of these SPACs now do not play these games where there is a warrant attached to certain things so that they get outsized economics. And the second, more interesting, is that these so-called SPAC sponsors also create so-called their own special syndicate with long-term, like-minded, dedicated healthcare investors to support these companies as if this is going to be an IPO. So as a result of these two things, I felt that, at the end of the day, this is an interesting alternative to an IPO or other way to fund otherwise perfectly exciting innovation-based companies. That's the genesis of how we thought of these things. But then the question is, at every board discussion will be, why would you want to take this versus an IPO, right? So what are the considerations? I would say is that first and foremost is why would you do this is about your capital needs, right? Unlike an IPO, usually, these days you would want to have a pretty strong roster of insiders, investors that you already have with you before you go IPO. Now, if you don't have that and you require a large sum of capital, that becomes more challenging for an direct IPO. And so therefore, a lot of times what the bankers these days will advise companies to do is, why don't you do a so-quote crossover round, after which then you can do the traditional IPO. If you were to do these two steps, it will take some time and logistic challenges. And another alternative transaction people talk about is a SPAC, a de-SPACing process, right? And the question is, what are the right type of companies to do that? I would say, if you think about the capital needs, if you only need, let's call it $50 to $150 million, traditional IPO sounds perfectly fine. But if you need more outsized amount of capital relative to your market value expectation, for example, you need $300 to $500 million for $1 billion transaction, then I think that SPAC is a perfectly legitimate consideration. A lot of the dilutions or the promote from the SPAC sponsors gets diluted away, so it doesn't feel like IPO is more advantageous from that perspective. The second, perhaps more important, is I talked about the two-step, right, crossover to IPO. Then the de-SPACing is a one-step process, so eliminates some of the uncertainties related to IPO two-step process. So these are the type of both capital required and the speed at which you want to achieve this are key considerations that people think about at the boardroom level. And the third, I think I touched on a little bit, is around the SPAC investors, right? IPO, sometimes you may not have the luxury to choose who you want to be dealing with post becoming a public company, because the IPO process is allocation based. For the SPAC, it's quite interesting, right? Because the SPAC sponsor already has a roster of insiders that's attached with that SPAC. So therefore, you actually de facto can choose who you want to play with from an entrepreneur management point of view. So sometimes it's advantageous, sometimes it's not. So it really depends on the sponsor. So anyways, there's another consideration typically a management and board would consider. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ricky. Mike, when you think about the two alternatives from a fundraising perspective, do you see any implication for the ability for further innovation? Is one preferable to the other when you think about future innovation?
Yeah, I mean the technicalities that Ricky talks about are, above my head. But I think the distinction I typically draw is whether you have a platform where land grab and getting there first is really important. In which case, one of those avenues may be more important than the kind of slow build, where your proof of concept is will take time to emerge. But if you wait to do that, you may have already lost. So I think the amount of money, how quickly it comes, the ease of access, your ability to control it. I think there's some interesting platform technologies coming through the healthcare space, and I think those feel like they're more suited to the SPAC process. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think for those of us who are consumers, it's great to see that kind of the hopeful monsters, as Stephen Jay Gould would describe them. There's a lot coming through from which we'll benefit. We won't benefit from most of it, but we'll benefit from some of it. I guess the question is, for any individual, it's easy to have too much money attached to an interesting idea. But when it comes to technicalities, I'll defer to the Rickies of the space.
Interesting question from an audience member here regarding SPACs. And the question is, how global is the SPAC market? It seems that many of them are targeting high-profile U.S. companies. And the questioner asks, do you see a shift towards quality assets that may not be as well capitalized, but have been built on good science outside the United States?
I'll go first with a very simple answer. I'm seeing a lot here, people coming to us and saying, is there anyone interesting? Because typically, I refer to my earlier answer about Europe. There's a lot of stuff that's subscale here and undervalued. I think if it was sitting in the US, it would already be attracting a premium. So people are looking at that as a potential avenue for something that could quickly scale and meet the kind of demands of a SPAC. But
I agree. Europe is where I think I've seen some pretty robust activity. I think in other geographies, I think the IPO tracks, not just on NASDAQ, but on the exchanges, are pretty wide open. And so therefore, SPAC may or may not be as straightforward. And so I think, in those other geographies, I think people still prefer the traditional IPO route.
So we've got the company moving itself through innovation into the inflection point of a SPAC or an IPO. Now let's just think about these companies as public companies. What should they be thinking about in terms of how they can continue to foster innovation, and what sort of investment philosophy should they have moving forward? I guess we can start with Mike on how to continue to foster an environment of innovation as a public company.
So I always think, let's come back to that word diversity. I think the diversity of the approaches in the pipeline is important. And, we always ask people a simple question. If you just take $100 million, would $100 $1 million programs be better than one $100 million program? And most people say, yes, of course it would. We would see some stuff that we wouldn't otherwise see. And I think especially as you're thinking as a biotech, you have an unknown path forwards, whether it's to a major pharma, or you're going to go it alone because you're in a space that allows you to do that, like a cell therapy, gene therapy type approach. So I think fostering diversity, fostering follow-ons, fostering plan B, for when the drug doesn't do what you wish it did, but you actually find that the thing it does do is really interesting as well. And we tend to talk in early stage about a plan to learn. So rather than having a business plan, I think the plan should be, what are you going to find out? What vantage point are you going to gain on your opportunity? So your story is informed by, not just, yes, we have evidence that it seems to work here, but we also know where it's going to be positioned in the marketplace. We know what the value proposition is going to be. We know what part of the disease we're targeting. All of that contributes to confidence, either at the business development level at the pharma company, or and also to the size of the deal that gets done. Is did you do the work to prove that the drug works? So I think the more you have that sort of builds that out, the better. I think strong-minded, philosophical pursuit of one goal, I think, doesn't persuade me, and I don't think it persuades many others who are looking to invest.
Yeah. So this is actually a really important topic. I just give you the statistics why I think it's very important for anyone in the audience who is already thinking about that, already got there to think about. Last 3 years, I counted at least over 150 companies gone IPO on NASDAQ or related exchanges, and that's unprecedented. What that meant is that share of voice is going to be really challenging for you to be heard as you continue to want to go on for additional capital raising activities. So a couple of things I would think in a boardroom, and I was involved in many of these companies, and what we think about. Point number one is on capital formation. We have touched on the asymmetry, right? It's one thing to be able to graduate from kindergarten, right? And then now we're in the big school. We're in a big league now. We're actually a public company. Come with it is the responsibility and the idea of how you follow up and follow through. So the next piece is, capital formation as a follow-on, and that's something that everybody will have to start to discuss. But how do you do that? What is the necessity? What is required for investors to say, you know what, company A, you're great, we need to invest in you? That's point number one, so capital formation. Second piece is capital allocation. I think Mike touched on this a little bit, is, okay, now we have a one program or maybe two programs of platforms start to show interesting signals, intriguing, I would say. Now, how do we get that to actual fruition, right? Whether this is regulatory success or commercial success. These are type of things we need to start thinking about. Now, we have just raised $150 million. How do we allocate our capital so that we are putting everything on the critical path first and not really squandering the chance to be able to be excellent next, however how many years it may be? These are type of discussion we think a lot about. And the third is that, okay, what do you grow up to be, right? If this is one where we think we have a single company, single asset, we have the mission to get that onto the market as a single entity, or we think this is one we have multiple assets, we can prosecute for first two, but what do we do with the rest of them? Are there partnerships? Are there strategic things we should be thinking about? So these are the type of things I think are very interesting. And then most companies don't have to think about early on in their life cycle. As they've gone public, these type of topics start to come up. And the final piece I would say, dovetail all of this together. And what is the, related to being a public company? You have a new function you probably didn't have before called investors relations. That is going to be critical, not just having your person in place, but what is your IR message to the world so that investors like Bain Capital, like Fidelity, like Wellington, why should they listen to you?
That's very insightful, Ricky. As I look at the clock, we're coming to the end. So I'm going to throw one last question out to the both of you, which is probably on the minds of many in the audience. So if you looked at your crystal ball, it's been a very frothy market for the last couple of years. And some have pointed to this being a bubble with the air coming out at some point in the future. If you had a crystal ball as you look at the rest of this year into 2022, what would you say to the folks on this audience today as to your thoughts about what the future holds? Yeah, nobody wants to go first. So Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about, maybe 30 seconds on what you see for the future of innovation?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bubble. I think that the demand is strong from pharma. I think it's become more acquisitive. I think it's looking for ideas that are, phase 3 ready, oven ready ideas to come through. I think they're giving, biotechs a lot of space. We've seen the tipping point at the FDA. More companies outside the top 30 are getting approvals than companies inside the top 30. So I think there's a lot of really interesting fundamentals. I think the big needle that could prick this is if the US ever gets challenged on price. That the US is sustaining most of the innovation in the rest of the world. So that's the only sort of dagger hanging over this this marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just summarize my thinking. I think for investors who are in this game, I hope everybody has the right patience. I don't think it's every 6-month game, not a year game. If I just look at the last 2 years, there has been parts of valley, and there is also other peak in terms of investor sentiment towards life science. And to me, the most important thing is really focus on innovation. Disruptive innovation actually will have value creation that the investors actually all agree that yes, that's innovation. By providing molecules, providing treatment that ultimately can benefit patients. If you have that goal in mind, you will be successful in no matter what the marketplace will be.
Thanks, Ricky and Mike. As I look at the clock, I think we're right at 12:45. So with that, I think we'll hand the floor back over to the New York Bio team.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. What an interesting panel discussion. Good afternoon. I am Jennifer Hawks-Bland, the CEO at New York Bio. Thank you for joining New York Bio and the New York Stock Exchange for our third Emerging Biotech Company Showcase. I was blown away by the cutting-edge science that was presented today. At New York Bio, we work to support the growth and the development of the life science industry in New York. And today, our reach expanded across the Atlantic to learn some of the amazing work that AM Pharma BV from the Netherlands, Vicore Pharma from Sweden, Noema and AB2 from Switzerland, Mnemo from France, Dante Labs from the UK, BioInvent from Sweden, and Oryzon from Spain are leading across many different areas of therapeutic and scientific advancement. I also learned more about cross-Atlantic investing. The business of developing therapeutics for patients is global, and so is the business that supports biotech, including investment. Capital flows regardless of borders. And speaking of capital, as I said earlier this morning when we kicked off, there is nothing more traditionally New York than capital markets. Therefore, we are especially proud of our partnership with the New York Stock Exchange as we work together to highlight emerging biotech companies. We are grateful to our sponsors, Woodruff Sawyer, Goodwin, Newmark Knight Frank, PHCBI, and TriNet. Their commitment to our biotech ecosystem makes this visibility possible for emerging companies. We hope you found the company presentations informative and inspiring. I know that I did. Please continue to join us for New York Bio events where you can connect with colleagues in our New York biotech ecosystem. Each week on Tuesday mornings at 9 a.m., we host a virtual breakfast webinar, and mark your calendar now for Monday, September 27th. It will be our annual meeting. And I feel like I need a bell going off. We will be meeting in person in the financial district in Manhattan. We also will have an online component for those who might not be able to make it to Manhattan for the meeting. But I, for one, am very much looking forward to shaking hands and speaking to people in person on September 27th. We thank you for participating today in the New York Bio, New York Stock Exchange Emerging Biotech Company Showcase. We hope to see you in person in September, if not before. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for joining us at our Emerging Company Showcase. Stay tuned for our next event on December 7th, in person at the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks again to all of our sponsors that made this event possible, and we will see you in December.